Just like this guy up here, I'm going to be occasionally taking some drinks of water. I apologize in advance. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it as Dr. Roberto was saying. I think that our exercise physiology program our clinical program has actually been really growing and kind of bucking some of the trends and growing in the past few years. I've been privileged to be a part of it. We've grown in depth at Methodist. We've grown in breadth as well by offering different sites. So we actually are doing cardiopulmonary exercise testing both at IU Methodist and IU West Hospital. And maybe we'll have more expansion in the future. It'd be wonderful. So I wanted to introduce you all to the idea of cardiopulmonary exercise testing. I have no financial disclosures. I can be somewhat boring, so that's my only disclosure. The other thing that I would like to disclose is that this is going to be an interactive talk, meaning that it is a lot more fun if you all would get your phones out and either go to menti.com or scan the QR code up there. There it is, a little bit larger. Scan that QR code, go to menti.com, enter in this 81055671. And apparently people are already learning that you can apparently like these slides on here, which is fantastic. So we're getting lots and lots of likes. I know. Let's get to a first question. This is easy, which is, what's your familiarity with CPET? And that is cardiopulmonary exercise testing. I will be calling it CPET. So we've got very familiar, vague idea. I've heard about it once or twice, or this is just literally my first time I've ever heard of this. We actually have a decent number of very familiars, which is really great. I'm excited about this. And again, that's right. They're all pulmonary, all pulmonary. Fantastic. Well, it gets me to my objectives, which is learning some of the basics. So we're not going to be deep diving. We're going to be doing a high level approach and then reviewing some mechanisms of activity and tolerance. And what I mean by activity and tolerance is how these variables play into it. Someone's age, someone's weight, their aerobic fitness, their ventilatory efficiency, and a little bit on pulmonary mechanics, although we're not going to really be talking about pulmonary mechanics all that much in this particular talk. If you're in the pulmonary division, you know this question. You know I love to ask this question, which is, let's imagine you got someone who's, they're on a weight loss program and they're being successful. They've lost 10, 20, 30 pounds of adipose tissue. How does the body get rid of that fat? How do they get it? I think I've got it hidden. So let me show the answers real quick. We've got urination, respiration, conversion to heat, defecation, perspiration. And yes, the people who hear me talk are getting this answer correct, or maybe you just know physiology better than I did before I was doing this. The answer would be respiration. And to understand this, the reason it's not conversion to heat in terms of how the mass is actually removed is to think of the body kind of like an internal combustion engine, right? We have a fuel source. We combust it with a little bit of oxygen. That fuel could be fat, could be carbohydrates, and we generate carbon dioxide and water. So we get a little bit of water out. So I guess urination and perspiration is some, but the bulk of the mass is coming out from carbon dioxide. So you take a big breath in, let it out, and there goes some of the fat and carbohydrate right there. I did mention that I am going to come back to this idea of a respiratory quotient. So the substrate that you use does matter. Respiratory quotient for fat is 16/23. That's about 0.7. The respiratory quotient for carbohydrates is a 1-to-1. So that's just the CO2 production, divided by the VO2 consumption. So again, 0.7 for fat, 1-to-1 for carbs. We're going to be coming back to that a little bit later. The nice thing about this is when we're measuring VO2, which is oxygen consumption, we're measuring VCO2, which is CO2 production. We are getting a glimpse into how these systems are interconnected in the body, which is why I love it. We're not focusing in on a single system. We're focusing in on a kind of a holistic whole body sort of level. So we're looking at patterns of O2 consumption, patterns of CO2 production, and we are using those patterns to make inferences about what's going on physiologically in the body. I would be remiss if I didn't include the Fick relationship in a talk about CPET. I feel like it's obligatory. And that is simply that how VO2 relates to different parameters in the body. It's actually pretty simple. At its core, VO2, your oxygen consumption, is simply how much oxygen is in your arteries. So the oxygen content in my arteries minus the oxygen content in my veins. And then I multiply by how fast blood is moving through that system. which is the cardiac output here, and I get my oxygen consumption. It's a very simple relationship. What is it? Well, the nice thing about oxygen and carbon dioxide is they're both gases and they're easy to measure with a gas sensor. That's what you see here. So an exercise test is a stress test. It is a progressive stress test. We generally will start easy and we'll do some sort of ramp where it's getting harder and harder and harder throughout the test. We have a flow sensor, an oxygen sensor, and a carbon dioxide sensor. That's all fits right here. And then we generally will include pre and post exercise spirometry to get you an idea of some pulmonary mechanics. What this stuff does is, of course, our flow sensor gives us a measurement of our minute ventilation. That's a VE. Our oxygen sensor gives us an idea of oxygen consumption, and our CO2 sensor, CO2 production. So back to that again, the patterns will give us a glimpse into what's going on in the whole body system. But again, we're looking at a whole body level. So you imagine this is kind of a 30,000 foot view. So in terms of using this diagnostically, really, we're not using it to find a diagnosis. We're using it to find a differential diagnosis for someone who has, say, unexplained exercise intolerance, right? So I may not necessarily be able to say, hey, this is the specific problem, but I might say, hey, the pathology is somewhere over here. Go look further in that area, or it's over here. And more than that, it's a prognostic tool. So in the general population, in heart failure and pulmonary hypertension and lots of other diseases, the better your VO2 is, or your VO2 max is, the maximum oxygen consumption that you can have, the less worried I am. The lower it is, the more worried I may be. We use all that to get a plot that looks like this. This is called a 9 plot. It looks pretty cumbersome and it looks pretty involved. We've got VO2 and several other variables in each of these little things. We can divide this into cardiac parameters, kind of ventilation parameters here, pulmonary mechanics in the green here, and the white gives us this respiratory exchange ratio that's related to the respiratory quotient, gives us an idea of effort. So it seems kind of daunting, it seems kind of intimidating, but that's the way I felt the first time I went to IKEA. And just like the first trip, just like my first trip to IKEA, we're not going to be going into the details. Maybe we don't even see the Swedish meatballs. We're just going to take it all in and hopefully get an idea of a gestalt of things that are going on there, okay? All right, so to get started, I've got two people that I want to introduce you to. We have a 77-year-old gentleman and a 37-year-old gentleman. The 77-year-old gentleman was someone with COPD, mild to moderate. Based on the old criteria, we call it moderate. New criteria, we call it mild. He was sent for a CPET because it was felt that his exercise intolerance was out of proportion to the degree of airflow obstruction. He was very limited in what he was able to do. So his FEV1 was 1.87, that's 67% predicted. And we can extrapolate what his MVV is. This is kind of your maximum minute ventilation that you would expect this person to be able to do. So if I take this number and multiply it by 35, that gives me a decent estimate of an MVV for this gentleman of 65 liters per minute, which is a lot, at least compared to what you're doing at rest. And his maximum workload was 54 watts. Now, if we compare that to what I'm using as a control patient, a 37-year-old man, same height, same weight, the control person had an FEV1 of 4.64 liters. So their minute ventilation or maximum minute ventilation substantially higher in the 160s. Their maximum workload was 380 watts. I want to put more numbers on this and point out that the reason that this person was sent for a CPET, the reason for the activity intolerance is when we put them on the bike, despite the fact that there was only a 2.5-fold difference in FEV1, there was a 7-fold difference in peak work activity. So I think in bulk, that was like the question. Why is this person not able to do this amount of work when really their mechanics don't look horrible? And so that's what we're going to go throughout this. This is plot 1, which is that very top left corner plot that I showed you before of each of these patients. We have our 77-year-old over here on the left. We have our 37-year-old over here on the right. I want to take you through what happens during the test. So during the test, we fit the oxygen sensor on the patient, and we actually just have them sit there on the bike for a while and just kind of acclimate to things. We tell them to breathe normal, which of course means that they're not going to breathe normal. And then once they've kind of reach some sort of steady state, we'll ask them to start pedaling. That's where exercise happens right here. But we won't actually add any resistance on for about 3 minutes. About 3 minutes in, we start adding intensity. We start adding some resistance onto the bicycle pedals. And we record that in watts. So this gentleman was able to generate 58 watts of work. This gentleman was able to get up to, say, 370 or so watts of work, which I realized, is anyone in here a cyclist? Or does Peloton, or has a gestalt of what this sort of workload is? I think if you're a cyclist or you row, you kind of have a gestalt. And if not, then this term watts is kind of esoteric. And this is one of my corny questions that I like to ask. A watt is a joule per second. A joule is how much energy you need to lift something that weighs like 1 Newton up a distance of 1 meter. All right. So what fruit weighs approximately 1 Newton? Let's see what we got here. Obviously, I'm going to take a drink while you all are answering. We got 10 people going with apple. So the 12 are actually correct. Good job, everyone. The 12 are correct. It's about an apple. So if you take an apple and you lift it 1 meter, you've done 1 joule of work. If you put it like on a string and like are pulling it up by 1 meter per second, you're doing your work rate is 1 watt. And if you have, here's my other AI image, if you have a box of 200 apples that you are lifting up by 1 meter per second, you are doing 200 watts of work. So now you know what a watt is. All right, back to these. So we got 58 watts, so 58 apples, 1 meter per second, 380 apples, 1 meter per second. And that corresponded to a VO2 of just under 1 liter per minute for this gentleman, and a VO2 max of, or excuse me, a peak VO2 of 3.5 liters per minute. And we hope that that peak VO2 that we see on this corresponds with a VO2 max. A VO2 max is like a theoretical physiologic limit. What is the maximum amount of oxygen consumption that I can have in a given amount of activity? So let's talk a little bit about what our determinants of VO2 max are. Let's start with age. True or false? I think people are going to get this one. VO2 max remains relatively constant throughout life. Is that a true statement or a false statement? No hesitation here. We've got false and a few more likes on the slide. I really appreciate the likes, guys. So yes, that is false. If we look at people over time, the VO2 max generally decreases over time. This data was extrapolated from a study of over 100,000 people at the Cleveland Clinic who were followed over 10-year time period. Early in life, in your 20s, median VO2 max is around 35 for females. For males, median VO2 max in their 20s is about 40. Those tend to decrease with time. Just to kind of give you an idea of what this relates to, so 35 would be equivalent to about 10 METs. That's kind of what you would need to be able to run 6.5 miles per hour, something along those lines. So that's what these people would be able to do. If you were down here, you wouldn't be able to do that level of activity. So 35, 40, those are medians for people who are in their 20s. What's a world record, do you think? That's when you just get to like click on something. World record VO2 max. It's about this dude, by the way. It's his name is Oscar Svensson. He's Norwegian, of course. He's a cyclist, as you might have gathered from the picture. Everyone's doing a pretty good job. The answer is around 97. So I think the people that I put in pink are saying are correct. So congratulations, you all. I don't have any prizes. Next question. A high VO2 max is associated with improved longevity. True or false? So we got 27 for true, 5 for false. I would agree with the people who said true here. If we look at this study once again, this study was again from Cleveland Clinic. It was in JAMA from, I think, 2018. And they divided people into basically low quartile. So this is bottom quartile people. This is below average, or technically below median. This is above median, above average. This is highest quartile. So, and then they actually had an elite, which is like the top 2 percentile as well, that I didn't include on here. If we take those and we look at their risk factors in terms of mortality and look at a Kaplan-Meier curve, being in the bottom quartile is actually pretty bad. Your risk of mortality is substantially worse if you're in the bottom quartile compared to any of the other quartiles. How bad was it? Well, if we look at traditional risk factors that people had and what hazard ratios were, smoking, you have a hazard ratio of about 1.4. So if you're a smoker, chances of dying at any given point in that 10-year period, say 1.4 times. If you're a non-smoker, coronary disease, 1.3. So you can kind of see all these are hovering around the 1 point whatever. ESRD, so some sort of organ failure, that bumps you up to a hazard ratio, mortality hazard ratio of 2.8. If you're in the bottom quartile versus the highest quartile, hazard ratio for mortality is in the 4 to 5 range. So we're not talking 1.4, we're talking 4 to 5. So huge in terms of aerobic fitness and prognostication. This is why I say that when we use it as a diagnostic tool, we're not just using it as a diagnostic tool, but this tells me how, how concerned do I need to be about things. And the reason of that is because, of course, it integrates everything, right? If my lungs don't work, my VO2 will be low. If my heart doesn't work or my valves aren't working, my VO2 will be low. If I have pulmonary hypertension, low VO2. If I'm anemic, low VO2. If I'm sarcopenic from poor nutrition, or if I'm sarcopenic from say cancer, low VO2. So this is one of the reasons that a CPET is probably more of a sensitive test than a specific test, and why I say when you're using it diagnostically, you're getting a differential diagnostic, not something specific. It also has implications functionally, as I mentioned before. 35 is what you need to run like 6 to 6.5 miles per hour. Climbing stairs, maybe a little bit below that, and walking 3 miles per hour is somewhere here. So if I'm in the bottom quartile, not only is my longevity poor, but these sorts of, like if I'm sitting right here, this sort of activity, climbing stairs, this sort of activity, jogging, that is not available to me. That is something that you may as well ask me to fly, because this is outside of the realm of what's physically possible. Is it trainable? Can we improve it? What do you think? True or false? VO2 max is trainable. So the answer here is yes, to an extent. There are some genetic factors, of course, but yes, it is trainable. It turns out that interval training does tend to improve your peak VO2 more than steady state training, more than walking does. Not to discount walking or anything. If we look at people, these are not patients. This is a sports science paper. If we were to look at people and compare slow steady state versus interval training tends to increase our VO2 max more, whether that's HIIT style training or interval style training. Now, listen to me. This is not me saying, if you are completely naive to exercise, obviously I'm not saying to go and do a HIIT workout. The downside of doing a HIIT workout is the higher intensity, the more likely you are to get injured. If you're injured and then not doing anything, you've lost any gains that you have from whatever sessions. So if you're completely naive, I would never tell you to do interval stuff. I would tell you to do steady state stuff, and even interval training should be really probably a minority of what you do. Overview. VO2 max, powerful prognosticator. I think I've made that point. It predicts what we're able to do. It tends to decline with age, but that is trainable to a certain extent. So that's what I've got so far. I think next we're going to go into the effects of weight. So the effects of adiposity. So one thing that I will note is that the VO2 max that I've got written here is in milliliters per minute per kilogram. So the more kilograms of non-lean weight that I have, the more kilograms of adipose, the lower this is going to be. So if someone is struggling with obesity, I mean, this is one of the reasons that, these new GLP-1s, of course, are so nice, not only just from a cosmetic standpoint, but from a functional standpoint, is if I can reduce non-lean weight, if I can reduce adipose weight, that's one of the best ways that I can improve my VO2 max. Fellows have heard me say this. Yeah. So if VO2 max is my ceiling of what I'm able to do, obesity sets the floor. What I mean by that is, I'm going to take an extreme example. This is a 43-year-old with, I don't recall what the BMI was, but with a significant amount of obesity. Again, we start off by having them just sitting there, and then we have them pedal, but we don't add any resistance onto the pedals initially. My healthy control, there's a little bit of a bump in VO2 when you're doing unloaded pedaling, unloaded cycling. With obesity, you see a huge jump here. In fact, if I go from my floor to my ceiling, I've used over half of my capacity just with moving the legs in this particular person. So if I put that on top of the graph that I've shown you before, if VO2 max is my ceiling, obesity kind of sets the floor in terms of what I can do. And the narrower and narrower and narrower this gets, the less activity that you're able to do. So let's get back to our patient. Let's see if we can differentiate these a little bit. So our 77-year-old for 54 watts, our 37-year-old about 370, 380 watts. Right here, the 54 watts resulted in a VO2 of about maybe just shy of 1 liter per minute. Just to make it easier, I'm going to call it 1 liter per minute. Let's take a look at what our 37-year-old was doing at 50 watts. So 50 watts is right about here for the 30-year-old. And if we go over here and we go up to our VO2, that's also just shy or right around 1 liter per minute. So we haven't necessarily distinguished those two people. And remember, if I told you at the very beginning that these two people had, even though they were 4 decades apart in terms of age, they're the same height and the same weight. So that's actually what you would expect. You would expect the same VO2 for a given amount of work. So we haven't distinguished them. I've got in blue my 37-year-old. So for 50 watts, they needed 1 liter per minute of oxygen consumption. Same with my 77-year-old. Now, I'm putting a hypothetical person with obesity here just to kind of just for comparison purposes. If we had someone with obesity here, we would expect the VO2 to be higher. So we would see a little bit of differentiation there. With our 37-year-old and 77-year-old, we haven't seen differentiation yet. So we don't necessarily know why the workload is so different. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, I mean, shoot, did the guy give a good effort? I mean, maybe this guy could have kept going like this. Did he give a good effort? How do we sort that out? Well, let me ask you this. Which of these do you think is most likely to be a submaximal effort? Is it A, B, C, or D? Question's getting a little bit more harder, maybe less intuitive. All right. So I would argue that the correct answer here is A. The reason I would argue that is actually more not to do with the VO2, but related to the VCO2. As you recall, as we're increasing our intensity, things happen. Our respiratory quotients change because we're shifting from fat to carbohydrate. So that's automatically going to shift our CO2 production from a 0.7, so less than oxygen consumption, to equal to oxygen consumption. So if we go here, we can kind of see CO2 is below oxygen. CO2 is in blue, oxygen is in red. Again, CO2 blue, oxygen in red. It starts to meet up with oxygen later in exercise. So this is kind of our shift from fat metabolism to carbohydrate metabolism. But then something interesting happens is that the CO2 actually surpasses the oxygen consumption. We call this a high respiratory exchange ratio. And my next question is, why do you think the CO2 increases out of proportion to VO2 in late exercise? We can understand the one-to-one, the carbohydrate, but why does it exceed my VO2? Is it because I'm increasing my combustion of fat? Am I hyperventilating? Am I buffering a metabolic acidosis? Or am I developing hypercapnia in late exercise? Great. So I would agree with the bulk of people who said buffering a metabolic acidosis. So, and that gets me into this notion of aerobic fitness, or this notion of our anaerobic threshold. So as exercise intensifies, not only am I shifting over from fatty acid in terms of metabolism to glucose, but I'm actually utilizing both aerobic metabolism, which is shown over here. So this is like oxidative phosphorylation, Krebs cycle. So early in exercise, fatty acids, products of glycolysis, those all converge onto acetyl-CoA and go into the Krebs cycle. In later exercise, I'm becoming more reliant on this oxygen-independent mechanism, my anaerobic mechanism. And instead of pyruvate getting shunted into acetyl-CoA into the Krebs cycle, my pyruvate is getting shunted into lactate. Production of lactate is associated with a metabolic acidosis. So during exercise, not only do I have carbon dioxide that's from combusting carbohydrate, I have a source of bicarbonate that is coming from just buffering this metabolic acidosis. My easiest way of buffering metabolic acidosis is respiratory, right? Kiddies are going to take forever. So I'm going to use bicarbonate and make carbonic acid and then carbon dioxide. This is my easiest way to buffer. And so I have two sources of carbon dioxide. This gets me to my one-to-one, and then this is why my VCO2 starts to outpace. So if I go back to these people, my respiratory exchange ratio, which is my carbon dioxide production over VO2, that'll start to become one-to-one as I'm getting into carbohydrate metabolism. And then as I get into my anaerobic capacity, it goes well above that. In our lab, we generally use an RER of 1.1 to suggest a maximal effort if you've made it higher than that. Some places use a 1.15. When we were setting up a thing at West, we would compare. We got some volunteers to do VO2 maxes, and basically we had a competition who could have the highest VO2 max and who could have the highest RER, and we kind of use that as who could suffer the most. So once you hit your anaerobic threshold, can you increase your VO2 anymore? Can you augment your aerobic metabolism anymore once you've hit this? Yes or no? We've got a little bit of a split, but I agree with the 15 of you all that said yes. That's because, of course, you see my anaerobic threshold I've marked here. You can kind of see I'm shifting my VCO2 up to 1-to-1 and then over. But even after my VCO2 has surpassed my VO2 is still increasing. So even this is well into anaerobic capacity, into past the anaerobic threshold, but I'm still increasing my aerobic metabolism. Why? It's because of the Bohr effect, the thing that we all know from, probably first year of medical school. This is a lovely study from the UCLA group, Bill Stringer et al. When this person was exercising, their PO2, their partial pressure of oxygen in their femoral veins, got down to 20 and never went down below that. So that's probably in this person, that would be like the minimum gradient that you would need to diffuse oxygen over to your mitochondria to actually generate work. But you were still able to offload oxygen. So this is moderate work. This is intensity work, high intensity work. You're still able to offload hemoglobin. That's just associated with, and that's of course associated with acidosis, which, by the way, the degree of acidosis that you can get during exercise, I think, surprises everyone who sees this. Femoral vein getting down to a pH of 7.02. Think about how you would feel if you saw that in the hospital setting, right? All the time during our invasive tests, and then the last blood gas has a lactate of 13, and then it's like, all right, time to go home. How do we find it? We generally will look at the plot of the VCO2 over the oxygen consumption. When it's really flat, that generally will reflect fatty acid metabolism. When it gets really steep, that's my CO2 outpacing my VO2. And so I will look at the point where this slope and this slope meet, and that's where my anaerobic threshold is. It correlates very, very well. If I were to measure lactates for people, it correlates very well to the to when lactate is being produced. I think this is going to be an easy question. Is your anaerobic threshold trainable? One person out of spite. Oh. Yeah, of course. And it's really important in terms of our anaerobic threshold is really important in terms of how short of breath we feel. So I think everyone's going to get this question. What's a primary driver of minute ventilation? Is it oxygen or is it CO2? So yeah, it's obviously CO2. And as we already talked about, once we get past the anaerobic threshold, my CO2 production starts to accelerate dramatically. And if I look at my minute ventilation, which is shown over here, past anaerobic threshold, my minute ventilation starts to accelerate rapidly. So if I can train myself, if I can improve my anaerobic threshold over here and keep this as flat as possible, then I can do the same amount of work and breathe less. And it's not just theoretical. This is validated experimentally. This is a paper from like the 1980s. Getting back to what Roberto was saying about this being a dying art, I'm citing stuff from the 80s, but that's all right. This is a single patient who is on a bike, and he's going easy here, medium here, really hard here. He's going from 0 minutes to 15 minutes. And this is not, the y-axis is not how hard he's pedaling. The y-axis is the minute ventilation, how much he's breathing. This is before and after 2 months of dedicated aerobic endurance training. After doing this, he gets on the bike, does the same activity again, and minute ventilation, especially at those higher intensities, have decreased from like 120 liters per minute. Think about that. That's 2 liters per second of minute ventilation, like a 2-liter Coke bottle of air movement every second. That's a lot. Down a third to 80. This person obviously is going to feel better at these higher workloads than they were beforehand. We can do this, and that was a normal person. We can see this in people with COPD as well, and of course cardiac rehab as well. This is a group of COPD patients. This is comparing a high work rate and a low work rate interventions in terms of pulmonary rehab. And when we do a higher work rate group and we compare people before and after, the amount of lactate that's getting produced is decreased. That results in a decrease in VCO2. That results in a decrease in minute ventilation. And not only, I didn't show this, but not only are you decreasing your minute ventilation, but all of these people with endurance in the high work rate group improve dramatically. How can we explain this? Is anyone a cyclist or does Strava has seen like a power duration curve? All right. We have one person. So power duration curve is literally kind of comparing the intensity that you can do with how long you can maintain it. So harder stuff I can't do for very long, so short periods of time. Lower intensity stuff I can do for long period of time. And that's really related to your anaerobic threshold. Your anaerobic threshold is when lactate starts to increase, but it can increase at a steady state for a while. So you can have like a bump from, say, a lactate of 1 to a lactate of, say, 2 or 3, and it still stay at like a steady state at that intervention. At some point, called this critical power, you get to a point where your lactate generation is more than what you can actually consume. And so it just builds and builds and builds and builds. That's when the short duration comes in. That's when you're on the clock because whatever you're doing, you can't sustain it for very long. So this is a hypothetical person who maybe has COPD, has poor aerobic conditioning. And walking the stairs, they can only go for a really short period of time. That's high intensity work for them. Walking, less intense, but they can still only go for a short period of time. So what would we expect for someone going through and improving their aerobic capacity with pulmonary rehab? We'd expect their anaerobic threshold to go up, this critical power that I was mentioning to go up, and this entire curve to increase as well. So what does this mean practically to the person? Well, stairs, maybe you can do it for a little bit longer, but it doesn't really change things. Walking, moving from something like this to this, that means I'm getting out of the house. That means I'm going to the park. That means I'm going and spending time with friends. I'm going to the grocery store, excuse me. All those activities of daily living that were maybe not available to me before rehab are suddenly now available to me. It's very real. And so let's talk about aerobic fitness and how that compares with our patients. So if we look at where we were at 50 watts, this is around when our 77-year-old stopped. He had an RER, a VCO2 over VO2 of about 1.05. If we look at our 37-year-old man, his CO2 was still well below his VO2. So we know that his minute ventilation wasn't getting driven nearly as much as this guy's was. So we had 0.8 for our 37-year-old. So for a VO2 of 1 liter, we have a VCO2 or CO2 production of only 0.8 liters. For our gentleman who is 77 years old, he had a RER of 1.05. So for that 1 liter, he actually had to generate 1 liter per minute of carbon dioxide. And if we took a hypothetical person at, say, 1.2, because they're working harder, that would get us up to 1.4. So we're starting to see a little bit of separation. And we know that the VCO2 is what drives minute ventilation. And that gets me into the next part of the talk, which is this notion of ventilatory efficiency. So if aerobic fitness is how the VCO2 relates to the VO2, ventilatory efficiency is how the minute ventilation relates to VCO2. We generally will express this as either a ratio, so we'll follow the VE-VCO2, that's the purple here, the darker purple, over time, or we'll look at it as a slope where we have minute ventilation on the y-axis and VCO2 on the x-axis. So we'll look at it either as a ratio or a slope. Next question. Higher VE-VCO2 is associated with increased longevity, excuse me. Is that true or false? Thanks again for the likes. I appreciate it. So I am going to agree with the 4 of you that said false. Why? A higher minute ventilation for a given amount of CO2 means that I am less efficient. That means I am working harder to breathe. That is correlated with my dead space fraction based on this relationship here. You can do the algebra in your head, but practically, if I have a lot of dead space, if I have an alveolus that I'm ventilating but not perfusing, that means that all the CO2 that's going to this alveolus is not making it, or that's going to this area, it's not making it into this alveolus. So all the minute ventilation that's going in and out of this alveolus is wasted. It's dead space. So I have to breathe more. I have to have a higher minute ventilation for any given amount of CO2 production. So this is like my poor man's marker of dead space fraction. As long as my PaCO2 is hanging stable, this will be related to my dead space fraction. So as my dead space fraction increases, my VeVCO2 will also increase. Well, you'll notice that if I'm looking at the ratio, not the slope, if I'm looking at the ratio, the VeVCO2 starts off kind of high and then it decreases to 25 or so and it increases. So why is it decreasing early in exercise? We have a shift from fat to carbohydrate metabolism, metabolic acidosis, decreased dead space, increased dead space, or metabolic alkalosis. Yeah, so the answer here is decreased dead space. So as you are, it specifically decreased dead space fraction, right? So as I'm taking a larger breath, my anatomic dead space is remaining relatively stable, but my tidal volume is increasing. For me, my tidal volume will increase from resting of about 0.5 liter to when I'm at peak exercise, about 3 liters as a tidal volume. So my dead space fraction is dropping dramatically, often drops in half. Now you also notice that this VeVCO2 will increase in later exercise. So why is that happening? Why is it decreasing here? And by the way, I usually report this bottom number here, but it increases in later exercise. Is it a shift from fat to carbs? Is it metabolic acidosis, decreased dead space, increased dead space, or metabolic alkalosis? I'm going to take a drink of water while y'all are answering. So I like that everyone is thinking dead space or metabolic acidosis. I'm going to agree with the 14 of you all that said metabolic acidosis. Remember how low that pH gets and remember your Winter's formula. So as we're getting more and more acidotic, we're dropping our PaCO2. So that's the little red herring here. So as this drops, my VeVCO2 will also go up. That results in this increasing. And then if I'm even looking at the slope will increase as well. I generally measure this slope here before it starts to take off. That's a little bit controversial. Some people in the heart failure world will measure the entire thing. Normal values are around 25, and which should make sense. Like if I had a theoretical patient with no dead space, so this entire thing were 0, my VeVCO2 would be about 21 if there were 0 dead space. So in a normal healthy, say 20-year-old, it would be about 25. That tends to creep up with age. So it gets up into the upper 20s and low 30s with age. If I take someone who has a lot of dead space, so a person with pulmonary hypertension, this is one of my patients who was identified with an abnormal cardiopulmonary exercise test. We'll see this. This is one of the things that, this is one of the hallmarks of pulmonary hypertension on exercise testing. The VE to VCO2 slope is extremely high. And so in this case, the slope was 48. That means that compared to someone without pulmonary hypertension who has a slope of 25, this person is breathing basically twice as much for any given amount of CO2. So of course they're more short of breath. Now we started treating, and of course we follow people by echocardiogram, by heart cath, and a number of parameters. But we can also follow people by exercise test, and we will often see this slope decrease. So the amount that they're having to breathe for a given amount of carbon dioxide is less. If you look, I mean, this is like a third difference. Here at 1.5, at a VCO2 of 1.5, this person was breathing 81 liters per minute or so. Same level of CO2 after treatment or as we're ramping up treatment, down into about 60. So like a third less. And of course, if you're having to breathe less, of course you feel better. Of course you're less short of breath. So our differential for VeVCO2, basically we have things that cause dead space and things that cause a low PaCO2. So these things are dead space, top 4. These things are low PaCO2. All right, so let's look at our patient again, our 2 patients. Remember, they had a VO2 of 1 liter. Our 37-year-old had a VCO2 of only 0.8, and our 77-year-old had a VCO2 of like 1.1. And then we have our hypothetical person here. Our patient had COPD. It was considered mild to moderate in terms of airflow obstruction, but they had a significant amount of emphysema. Emphysema, it's dead space. We have areas that are ventilated, but because we have alveolar destruction, there's no blood flow that is able to go and perfuse those areas. And so we have a ton of dead space. Ventilation without perfusion. What did their slopes look like? Well, if I look at my 77-year-old, the VeVCO2 slope was 54. That means that for every given amount of every liter of CO2, They had to breathe 54 liters or 54 liters per minute to remove that from the body. Compared to my 37-year-old, that was 27. So my 27-year-old is breathing half as much as my 70, or my 37-year-old is breathing half as much as my 77-year-old. If we plug that back in and we see where that goes, where that gets us in terms of minute ventilation, our 37-year-old, we multiply that out by 27, we get a minute ventilation of about 21 liters per minute. That is 12% of what that MVV was. Our 77-year-old with emphysema, that multiplied out is, 58 liters per minute. That's 76%. And then if we throw on the mechanics of it, if we throw on the pulmonary mechanics, it gets even worse. So typically, and this is a flow volume loop, we have flow here, we have volume here. Typically, this is the peak effort where someone is blowing as hard as they can and inhaling as hard as they can. We usually start off with a small tidal volume here in the middle, and we just work our way out. Someone with COPD, they start over here because they're scooped. And the only way they can breathe faster, the only way they can generate higher flow rates is to shift over this direction, because I can't get a high flow rate down here. That means that I have to breathe up here, which worsens my VQ matching even more. So with these patients, how do you intervene? Well, of course, if you have someone who has COPD, you try to improve their pulmonary mechanics by, say, giving them inhalers. That's happening down here. That does nothing for their aerobic fitness. If they're obese, that does nothing for this. And weight and aerobic fitness, that gets multiplied multiple times over as we kind of go over here. So in someone who's obese, dropping weight helps tremendously. And so any person with COPD, improving their aerobic fitness, or even if you don't have COPD, improving your aerobic fitness, that benefit gets multiplied out by whatever your ventilatory efficiency is. And of course, if I've got heart failure, diuretic, decreasing their pulmonary vascular congestion will improve my ventilatory efficiency. Pulmonary hypertension, treating the pulmonary hypertension, improving their VQ matching will improve my ventilatory efficiency. So each of these gets multiplied over and over and over again. So my final thoughts on this before we take questions is, it's multifactorial, exercise intolerance, powerful prognosticator. The ventilatory inefficiency is one of those things that I will look at, and as I've seen these cardiopulmonary exercise tests, you look at these and you think, of course they're feeling short of breath, obviously. And then finally, exercise is medicine. Pulmonary rehab and cardiac rehab are very real and really, really impact people's lives. In terms of some things, like I said, we've really grown our program. The Methodist team has been involved in doing invasive testing. That means that we do this mass testing with the pulmonary artery catheter in. So we're measuring oxygen consumption, hemodynamics while we're exercising. The West team, they've had the privilege of actually starting an entire exercise program de novo. So these two guys have been great. And this is me last week going on a run on one of the days when it was really nice out with my youngest son. My youngest son wasn't running. He was just enjoying the weather. With that, I'll take any questions. Thank you so much.